So my presentation is going to be a bit different in that I am hoping that at the end, my goal is to prime you all to read this poem by Senghor with me in the Q&A, given the framing information that will be presented during my talk. I'm going to have a much different perspective on the Romans than the last talk. And I think that it's interesting seeing the different and competing visions and fictions of Rome as one of our questions brought out, and I am interested in this talk in looking at Leopold Senghor's view of Rome and how this might shape the way that we look at him. And again, thank you to all the organizers. It is my first time at Race Before Race, and it has been a wonderful time, and this is such a wonderful community, and I was very honored to be invited. So, to begin my talk, I was struck by the theme topic for today because it, to me, forced a looking forward to the future of the discipline of classics, the discipline I currently call home, to a point in the discipline where we can discuss the transcendence of a racial trauma. In my estimation, though, it seems as though classics has scarcely begun to discuss, at least in antiquity, race or trauma separately, let alone together. And in some ways, it still seems as though race is viewed as modernity's hallmark ordering principle and trauma its diagnosis, and the field is just now beginning to take its baby steps into developing the language to discuss both in antiquity. Although those of us who touch the modern, those of us working in reception studies in particular, attempt to grapple with these questions, although it seems to me possible, verging on likely, that such a displacement of many of these concerns that into a field that does not play by and is not readily beholden to classics' rules, classics has a lot of rules as a discipline, is one that allows a displacement of the issues of talking about race into a subfield that is considered somewhat apart while keeping the traditional cores of the material intact. Thankfully, I believe these changes to be coming steadily. In the past few years, Princeton's own Racing the Classics has been convening to discuss systemic issues related to race, both in our organization as a discipline and our approach to material. In the summer of 2022, the field saw two very bright lights. Emily Greenwood's guest-edited issue on diversifying classical philology, which advocated both for approaching diverse bodies of material that intersect with the ancient, but also racialized and diverse ways of reading the classics. It features Catherine Harlow, who was supposed to be speaking tomorrow but is not here. And the second contribution is the overwhelmingly unpowerful Sarah Darabo's Untangling Blackness in Greek Antiquity, which does valuable recontextualizing and indeed archive-building work on representations of the ancient black peoples and how we might look at them anew as racialized subjects, although not beholden to the same kind of anti-black racism. Its splash has already been tremendous, and the lasting impact remains to be seen, something that I'm very much looking forward to. On the side of trauma, psychiatrist Jonathan Shea's 1994 Achilles in Vietnam has been hugely influential in Homeric studies, and more recently, the problem of trauma has been taken up from the perspective of individual case studies in response to violence. Larger socially oriented studies are forthcoming, including my own dissertation, but none, but none, to my knowledge, offer any extended treatments of race and trauma, so I come back to the header of the colloquium on transcending race and trauma. In my own work, I work on trauma, and I have it intersect with ethnicity. I did not think that this work was sufficiently racialized to be presentable today, but if you want to talk about Civil War and non-Roman Italic identity, we can do that in the Q&A. And I also work on race separately, And in this symposium, it has provided the challenge of looking at the two together and to transcend them. Although in my framing, I said that I think that reception can be used as a bit of a salve for the field in avoiding addressing old ways of thinking, this is not a problem that I plan on fixing myself today, and I turn to reception work, and I turn to reception studies to use Leopold Senghor to meditate on the idea of constructing, as Eric Gruen put it, like a non-lachrymose history of Black identity. And what one thinker on classics, Blackness, and the post-colonial world has to say about building a history around something other than trauma and what we can do in the face of archival absence. So, who was Leopold Senghor? He was a co-founder of the Negritude movement alongside Aimé Césaire and Léon Damas. He was a key player in the Senegalese decolonization moment, and he was a poet and the first president of Senegal. He served for quite some time. He served for 20 years. And he has received an uptick in attention in the Anglophone in the past 10 years, especially in fields interested in decolonization and Black social movements, as more people become interested in the philosophies of decolonization. So I present here, these are all from 2014 and 2015, Frederick Cooper's Citizenship Between Empire and Nation, Gary Wilder's Freedom Time, Negritude, Decolonization, and the Future of the World, and Ryland Rabaka's The Negritude Movement, which is on W.E.B. Du Bois to Frantz Fanon, including Aimé Césaire and Leopold Senghor. So in these studies, much attention has been devoted to the formations of negritude and Senghor's own formations of negritude and his rise as a politician and his philosophy, although fairly little has been devoted to his career at the time. And what exactly was he doing? Well, he was working as a classicist. and so Senghor was the first he was the first person to pass the aggregation exam at the Sorbonne in letters, and he immediately took up a professorial position in Greek and Latin at the Lycée Descartes in Tours, and he held that position for 10 years from 1935 to 1945. He showed a real dedication to the promotion of the cultural education throughout his career, and clearly the ancient exerted a strong influence over his visions for a culture of a post-colonial future, so much so that he was honored in Rome in 1973 for his global contributions to the study of Latin, and he was honored in 1977 with a festschrift, the one that I have in my bag back there, if you want to check it out, for his work on Latin and the advocacy for the study of Western culture. And what I want to do today is I want to present how looking at Senghor as a thinker on the ancient can tell us about his politics and poetics, and see if we can better understand his work, which has been subject to much criticism, and can we arrive either at a more sympathetic view or at least a sharper critique and based on what he is trying to get at, based on seeing exactly how he is conceiving of the ancient in his time. So what is he trying to achieve? I believe first, a vision of a Black past that is not defined by the great cultural traumas of slavery and colonialism and the racial discriminations in their wake. And second, a future of Pan-African cultural pride built around a new vision of Africa having a respectable cultural legacy and impact in a new and rapidly developing world order. Despite what his achievements from the Western Academy might have you think, he was not exclusively interested in the promotion of Western culture, and he realized that such a project required an intimate familiarity with and archive building work of African cultures. So he, being a man of letters and linguistics, began doing field work on Sero-oral poetry and Wolof linguistics. And he acknowledges a similarity to the Greeks, and as I was putting this together, I realized that the dates aligned quite closely with Milman Parry and Albert Lord's work on Homeric oral composition with Slavic bards. So, he uses this premise, this similarity, to start formulating his own ideas on the influence, on the African influence in a greater Mediterranean world. And he begins undertaking ethnology studies to help round this out while he is in tours. He goes back and forth between Paris. And during the war, Senghor is captured by the Germans and begins studying the ethnological work of Leo Frobenius, who views the Africans as akin to the Germans and begins moving in a further African origin of civilization direction. What he arrives at, he hopes neither has the European subsume the African nor the African subsume the European, but instead he advocates for a cultural mixing to bring about what he terms a civilization of the universal, combining the European rational and the African irrational. It should be noted that Senghor's irrational is not, in his view, inferior to the rational. In fact, quite the opposite. He views Europe as a society that has emphasized the empirical to the point of a society-wide spiritual death, whereas Africa, as a result of colonialism, has to a greater extent than Europe already taken its first steps towards a universalist embodiment of values. Senghor's reception for this point in particular has been largely controversial, if not negative, especially in Pan-Africanist circles. Cheikh Anta Diop was very critical of his admiration of European cultural heritage, and modern critics have called out rightly the racial essentialist nature of who he says Africans naturally are. Ryland Rabaka goes so far to state, I am having trouble reading this, this is not a double consciousness, at least on the Du Boisian sense, so much as it is a single consciousness, a colonized consciousness, a false consciousness that is predicated on and privileges Eurocentric views and does not challenge or destabilize Europe's long-held anti-black racist and colonial conceptions of Africa and Africans. Further, in Senghor's studies of the ancient, leading him to not be beating the allegations of his overly European accommodationist views, he seems to have, at least at the time, been trying to figure out a new model for the French colonial states, and he seems to have toyed alongside Robert de la Vignette with a model based on the Roman Empire. This may be shocking to you, and considering this is still very much an imperial model, and thinking along the lines of Vasunia and the British Empire, the imperial model that they at least seem to use in terms of training their officers, and doing such a thing seems frankly insane, and that the Roman Empire could be used as a launching point for any empowering post-colonial future. So why would he think like this? So, although today we tend to think of the sovereign, independent nation-state that falls roughly along some idea of ethnic lines as the preferable and inevitable goal of a post-colonial outcome, such a model was not inevitable and certainly not preferable to many. Much work, Getachew, Cooper, and De Jong in particular have recently drawn attention to concerns shared by many leaders of the colonial states on the matter of complete independence. The first problem is that independence may grant self-determinism, but would relinquish colonizers' responsibilities for the damages done by colonialism. Second, the colonizer state will remain in power by virtue of economic might, while having no obligation to maintain infrastructure or provide funds for the decolonizing states. And third, colonial systems' complete dismantling would mean the fragmenting of the economic and cultural ties to the other states under empire. Colonial states would be divided and conquered. The colonies together are stronger than their imperial cores, but apart they are weaker. So for many reasons, for this reason, many leaders preferred models of confederation at this time. You can see these brewing in the Caribbean, in Anglophone Africa, in Francophone Africa. They all fall apart, but they did have a confederation model in mind, many of them. But if you think about that, the Roman Empire could be seen as not too dissimilar if you adopt an old school view of it. Senghor would have viewed the empire as diverse, spanning 3 continents, and the provinces are mostly sovereign, but interconnected, and the center is not preferred to the margins, but everyone would have an equal citizenship and could send representatives to the center. This has been complicated in recent years, and its leader can come from anywhere, including Africa. I include the picture of the first African emperor, Septimius Severus, who founded a dynasty of North African emperors. This model obviously did not succeed, but it is interesting to see how, even looking at the very picture of empire, Senghor can use the ancient to project a vision of an idealized African past. So, as I close, I turn toward the Elegy of Carthage. So the Elegy of Carthage was written by Senghor in 1975. It is after Senegalese independence, and he is convening a conference for the All African States Conference, and is meeting in Tunisia, which in the Palace of Carthage, which is on the site of the center of the former North African Empire. What he does in this elegy is he addresses it to President Habib Bourguiba, the first president of Tunisia after his independence, and he uses 3 African figures, all distinctly African, but none explicitly racially marked, to illustrate how a Roman literary past can guide us towards a brighter African future. Bourguiba himself was torn between siding with Europe economically and banding together with the Africans, and you can see how Bourguiba can serve as an insert for the 3 African figures, the 3 African leaders that form the core of the poem. So each of the 3 central stanzas is dedicated to an African leader who suffers a different fate. The first is the founder of Carthage, the legendary founder of Carthage, Dido, who rejects Black Africa. See there. So, what had you asked so faithfully to the black woman, the great priestess of Tanit, color of the night? She listens to the distant sources of the rivers and the shadowy woods, to all the heartbeats of Africa. She would have reminded you of Yarbus, son of Garamantia, but you disdained her untamable black splendor. Why did you not break the agreement of the Aryan gods, of their faithful allies, as unfaithful as your Aeneas? Yet this evening I cry over you, Dido, my great desolation. So her demise, if you are not familiar with the story, she sides with Aeneas over Yarbus, who is an African chief who's trying to marry her, and then Aeneas abandons her, and then she dies by suicide when he leaves. His second stanza, dedicated to an African leader, is dedicated to the great Carthaginian general Hannibal, who is unsuccessful but glorious again because of his own ability to ally with other Africans. You never rested your foot on Mother Africa's neck. The Gaetulians and Libyans, the Numidians and the Nasamones, the Massilians, and again, Massilians, the Moors, the Garamantians with sunny black suede skin, and far in the west the Ethiopians, faithful companions of Atlas. You recognized all of your race, even the Iberians with the Berbers. What if Carthage had imitated you? You could go on. And then the final one, Jugurtha, who he views as his greatest African champion. It should be said that his use of Roman literary historical figures who are racialized and illustrate a racialized, if not racist, black past, both gestures towards a transcendence of colonial trauma, but simultaneously a connection to Bourguiba that was only constituted by a colonial Western education. Although one that folds in the African tradition itself, or ideas of Africa itself, and its performance is done with North African instruments, seemingly an attempt by Senghor to reintegrate a more African element into a text that is so embedded with its own colonialism. But even as he attempts to transcend it, it is hard not to notice his constriction by the canon. Still, he is able to do this in order to gesture at a message of Pan-African unity that he can undertake alongside Bourguiba, something that they can now do standing in the places of their own ancient predecessors. So with that, I would like to open up discussion and questions.
Thank you. That was great, and I love having the opportunity to read a poem that I've never seen before. I was just, in the spirit of reading this together, I just had an observation.
Okay.
And I was wondering what you thought about it, that in the first section, it's all in present tense, and it's just filled with this language of clarity. All is clear in the fog, all is joy, clear among the flowery smiles. And then in the second section where he's talking about disappointing Dido, it's all in the past. It suddenly slips into the past, and Hannibal's in the present. We go back to the present for Hannibal, but Dido is, I remember, it's in memory, I was a child for a long time, I felt you were so lost that I would have given you. And then when we're in Hannibal, we go back into, we take it in, and the, like a present tense. And I don't praise your courage. He's speaking as though this is actually present, and I don't know if you had thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think a big part of that actually has to do with the traditional place of the Aeneid as such a set school text. It is sort of generally and traditionally, when you are undertaking Latin education, the thing that you're building to. So, Senghor, a person very much trained in Latin, I think that he, and I think a lot of Latin students feel this way too, when you look at the Aeneid and you think about the Aeneid, it's almost like traveling in time back to the point when you are first encountering all of these people and you're first reading these stories for the first time. And I do think that it's interesting that, yeah, he is specifically a child, and he evokes, and he thinks about how he cried over Dido, and because her story really is quite sad. Whereas I think that when he sees the other figures and their militant spirits, I think that he thinks more of himself as the adult, the politician, the person who, has to interact with Europe in this more mature way. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. I wish I'd known this when I was writing about Dido. My education. My question, and it is about thinking about Dido as the one figure in here who is migrant, driven out of her homeland as a result of a conflict with a sibling over power, lands in this nation. Ibarra falls in love with her, offers her land. She's calculating, says, I want this much, constructs basically Carthage. She's still not yet incorporated into Africanness. My question is very simple. Do you think that's what's happening in this first section with respect to grappling with the tale that the Aeneid constructs and then the history of Dido after in relationship to Carthage/Tunis? And I can think about all kinds of ways this plays into Shakespeare, but I'm not, because I'm trying to be good.
Yeah, I'm very glad you asked that question.
So, and think about the fact that he begins with her trauma as an expelled migrant,
Yes.
landing with nothing, which brings us to our own histories of people being driven out of their homes economically, persecuted for religious or political beliefs. And so thinking about her place in this as someone coming and the hospitality, desire, complexity
Yes.
around her. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that.
I do have thoughts on that.
I like that.
Yeah,
Give us your thoughts.
I do have thoughts on that. I remember reading this and being struck by the phrase that scented with jasmine, the scent of your rhythmic joy, and how he associates Africa so deeply with rhythm. And there are no recordings of this, and I have looked and I've tried to find them, but I imagine just hearing him. I assume he's the one singing it. Hearing him, recite this poem over, this Maghreb orchestra and talking about the rhythmic nature of her, and thinking about how he thinks about Africa and Africans as naturally sensuous people. And it seems to me to demonstrate an acceptance and a sort of naturalness in her being there, which I think is striking considering she's a migrant. And I also think that that's interesting considering she is the one that rejects Africa, and Africa doesn't reject her. And I think that he thinks of Africa as this hospitable place that has already recognized what he might think of as a sort of ideal civilization of the universal, where people can come and make something of themselves if they are willing to embrace Africanness and Africa and blackness, which he says that she does not. And so that's kind of as far as my thoughts go right now. But I don't know if you were getting at anything specifically different. Yeah. Yes. So, right. So, I should have said this at the beginning of the question. The story is Dido, yes, comes from, she is Phoenician, she's from Tyre. So, she is from the Levant, and she, as Margot said, is driven out, and she comes to Africa and has nothing. And she, founds Carthage, which becomes Rome's great other.
Thank you so much. That was great. So I have a sort of a question that follows up this question about Dido, and it really struck me that I was wondering if this is tied to the idea of mestizaje that you brought up, because bringing Dido over, actually that mestizaje fails, right? Because she doesn't choose Africa, and it could have been then a form of mestizaje. But it fails because she doesn't choose Africa. So I was just wondering if you saw that there. I just, your talk and then this made that jump up, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yes, I think that it is. I think that it is supposed to, but that is supposed to be in the background. You might notice that in the other stanzas, you have a lot of different peoples coexisting in Africa. And even, Yarba, son of Garmantia, it's not quite clear if he is aligned with the great priestess of Tenet in the same way, how many different peoples are mixing together. It should also be noted that, this comes up in the poem, that Bourguiba is not black. He is Berber, he has, these striking blue eyes, and I think that a big part of it is that sort of everything can be even though Africa is only one part of the civilization of the universal in his way, I think that he could say that the universe is contained in Africa in a way, and that it is accepting of non-black peoples, and that there's a political import to saying this to the president of Tunisia, who is, at this conference with you, and this being your sort of like opening move, in creating a sort of like cultural political mixture, and seeing what happens when it fails, right? He doesn't have to explain what happens. Bourguiba already knows what happens to Dido. And I think that Senghor is saying that, yes, that this is a cautionary tale, that you have, that this vision of Africa is now available to you once again for the first time. And I am offering it to you if you accept it.
Thank you very much for absolutely fascinating talk. I'm going to throw 2 quick questions at you, if you don't mind. Please feel free to ignore them. The first is a question on the progression within this poem. So from the way that I understood the presentation, there's almost a journey towards completeness occurring within the time of the poem itself. So I wanted to ask you whether you thought that for Leopold Senghor performing this poem at a very specific moment, at a very specific conference, whether the poem's sort of deployment of a progression towards a better confederated or neo-imperial vision, however one may want it, whether this is supposed to be an eternal vision, an essential vision in the way that the critics were speaking about, or whether the poem itself is something that is intended to one day be transcended by another vision, whether there's a sort of awareness baked into this line of the fact that, yes, there are these kind of iterative visions of what this could mean, and this is just the one that is appropriate for right now. And the second part of this is more performance related. So it's about this note that you have on the North African musical instruments, and I'm kind of curious where this comes from, because a lot of the instruments that are listed over here, right, they harken back to another very large, sweeping imperial vision, because some of the instruments clearly have an Ottoman heritage or enter into the region. These are words in Persian as well, right? Kamancha is something that is played all the way out to in Xinjiang amongst Uyghurs. So there's another sort of imperial vision also being baked over here. And I'm curious to know whether that is something intentional as another alternative confederation that is being woven into this history, or whether that is actually deeply nationalized in this moment or regionalized to no, these are firmly North African. Thank you.
Yeah, so I will begin with your second question. So all of Senghor's poetry is put to music, and he scores it differently depending on the setting. So I'm not quite sure if Senghor is interacting with Persian history this deeply. I'm not sure he knows it. I'm not sure. I wouldn't say that he doesn't, but I would say that I'm not sure. I think that this might be him trying to think about what evokes a sort of vague vision of North Africa in his mind, but I will certainly look into that. As for your first question and thinking about the cyclicality of the poem, I am struck by how it begins, not with the figures. It begins with Senghor and his own arrival at the conference, and it's very, almost like meta-performative in that he ends with the same thing, and also these I didn't explicitly say this, but he is moving forward in history, and I think that one thing that should be brought out is that, at least in his presentation of the events of the Roman past, everyone continually gets closer to a realized unified Africa, but does not complete it. And so I do think that he is inviting Bourguiba to be with him in transcending it, in that there is a way to break out of, he offers a way to break out of a colonized African past in this way. I believe his hand has been up for a very long time.
Thank you so much for that talk. I just had a quick question about syntax. So as I was reading this, I couldn't help but, once you sort of started talking about the poet as a translator of both Latin and Greek, does this I might be reading this incorrectly, but does the syntax and the way that he kind of works with the words remind you of like Roman elegy and Greek elegy? Because just the construction seems like and it's really interesting if he's trying to use this kind of construction to deconstruct what depictions of Africans through this sort of Roman lens and how it works.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it should be noted that the poem is originally in French. I did not give you the French because it costs too much to print. For all of you. You can look it up. He does, I mean, he is trying, in a way, in his elegies, he does try to create something of an elegiac couplet form, but because it is set to music, it does not have a sort of more regular meter. It's more just he kind of goes longer and then a bit shorter and then goes longer and then a bit and then a bit shorter. But I think that it is a deliberate clashing of the forms, and that this clashing of the forms is supposed to think about. I'm not even actually sure if he probably would not call it a clashing. He would probably call it a wonderful universal blending. But so that's probably how I would characterize it. In terms of word order, I'm not sure. I would have to look into it.
First of all, thank you so much for your talk. It comes, at least for me, in a very helpful time. Recently, I had a class on African modern literature, and there was a huge debate in class because we were reading Juan Ngongo Thiong, critique on Senghor, and he was basically saying that African literature should be written in African languages instead of European languages. And it was really interesting to see your point and, kind of think through that. So my question basically is, do you think that the way that Senghor engaged with classical literature and culture, do you think that it relates or it provides any response to the performance that today's scholars of color have tried to engage also with the European, say, Western canon, and the responses that we usually get when we do that? The expectations that usually we feel that people have about you being a person of color engaging with a classical text? Thank you.
Yes, I would absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that. That this is that a lot of the critiques of him are, especially the very early critique by Shikanta Diop, is very much about why are you even paying attention to this body of work anyway. And I think that a lot of his critics really ignore that he showed a very real dedication to the promotion of African languages and literatures in Senegal, right? His problem with the canon is not simply like an imperial critique of, it's not simply an imperial critique of, this is the work of our colonizers and therefore it needs to be thrown out. He does have an issue with the canon, and his issue is mainly that it's not big enough, and that there is more stuff that can and should go into it. So, I mean, he was a really big proponent of educating students also in the African languages, and also the arts and poetic forms. And I had a bonus slide for you all. That he showed a very real commitment to this, in that in 1966 he had this festival of like global like Negro arts, but then at the same time he commissioned that Musée Dynamique and invited the French Minister of Culture to be one of the presiders over the thing. And inside the museum, you had a lot of the works of various like European artists working at the time, while you had this festival where you had people like Josephine Baker, Wole Soyinka. I can't remember who all they are. If someone was like a big African or black artist at the time, they were there. This was like the go-to event, and I think that and it's clear that Senghor thought that, and perhaps this was a doomed endeavor, but he thought that the way to promote a sort of global African cultural legacy was to sort of put African works and art forms up with European art forms and say these are just as good as each other and they belong together, and that the world works by having all of these in conversation with one another, even if their actual forms are different. I mean, if you look at the artwork here, you have this you have this very colorful, curvy, painting of this totem, and then you have on the other hand this sort of very like rigid, flat line, extremely white, strict neoclassical formalism. And I think that he thinks these two interplay together, and that in order to be sort of complete people, complete societies in a new post-colonial world, he thinks there's no undoing colonialism, but what we can do is we can put our vision against theirs, and we can and we can promote our forms and art and poetic models back, and this is something that many people did and do not agree with, and I think there's something to be said for that too.
We probably have time for one more question.
Thank you so much, Jermaine. That was amazing. And this question possibly sort of follows on from the previous one and slightly rolls it back. But just I'm really curious about Léopold Senghor's experience of intellectual life in 1930s France. And so sort of what was his experience of being a professional classicist in 1930s France? Like sort of what was, as a scholar of color, what was that experience for him like?
Yeah. He has less about the day-to-day than he does about, his vision. It's really interesting. A lot of the racial discrimination that he discusses in his classical training or in his classics career seems to come primarily from his training and from white teachers in Senegal, more so than ones in France. I don't know exactly I'm not quite sure what his experience with this, what his experience was being a classicist in terms of discrimination in France itself, although this is something that I'm starting to look into. We're kind of in the early stages of this project. The dissertation has been eating up most of my time, but and so I would be interested to see more of that. But I mean, it's quite interesting in that it seems that more of the discrimination that he, or more of the sort of like racial tensions that he talks about come from his experience in the army, which he's doing at the same time. But I would be interested to see more about him in the educational structure itself.
That was amazing. Thank you so much.